So we'll get started here. All right. So, welcome everyone. Thank you for your patience. We were just dealing with some technical difficulties, some OBS fun. But today I am joined by the one, the only, Mark Kilby. Hi, Mark. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Ben.
So, we set up this live stream to talk a little bit about hybrid remote, and you know a thing or two about remote work in general, even before the pandemic, before all of that mess. I think,
Yeah.
did you write a book about the subject?
Yes, I wrote a book with Johanna Rothman. So this
Mm,
book here, if I can get past the green screening.
very nice.
Yeah.
From chaos.
Um,
Very
from
cool.
chaos to successful distributed agile teams. We'll share that link out later.
Awesome.
Uh, that really uh, summarizes my 20 plus years and Johanna's 20 plus years of working with distributed and agile teams,
Hmm.
which some think is oil and water, but
Okay.
not necessarily.
Okay, so distributed agile teams was a thing that I think folks for a while was like, well, it can work, but it's hard, and you have to have all these good practices in place. And in my own experiences, it always seemed like folks who worked remotely were their needs were always second.
Yeah.
They never could participate in the way that those of us who could meet in person could participate. And now, obviously, like the pandemic played out, we had people who, you know, everybody went remote for a while, and now
Hmm.
there's like this surge of like companies going, crap, we're paying for property and for office space. Everybody back to the office,
Yes.
please. And there are lots of like good reasons perhaps for that from the P&L standpoint or whatever, but like some of it's also just status symbols. People want to get back to like I had my corner office or whatever.
Hmm.
So a lot of that kind of stuff that's holding us in place. So I thought maybe we could make a map of the situation because you're you feel really passionately about hybrid remote and in particular doing hybrid remote well and in a humane way. And maybe while
Yes.
I'm getting
Very
that
much.
set up, could you say a few words about your perspective and kind of why you feel so strongly about these kinds of things?
Yeah. So in the years that I've been doing this hybrid remote before the pandemic was what everyone hated for the reasons that you stated. Is if you were the remote person, you were kind of left to your own devices unless certain practices were put in place and there was some discipline around those practices, both for those who were remote as well as those who were in the office. And I don't even like the terms remote, virtual, distributed. I use them because that's what people search for on the internet, but it always gives that us versus them kind of feel to
Yeah.
the conversation. And even terms like remote first, I kind of wince a little bit. It's like, yeah, yeah, I get it, but it's more about call it location free,
Mm,
call it uh, under, different constraints or under constraint, whatever. It's really looking at, do we understand the key principles of our work and workflow, and what do we really need to make that happen? And are we putting excessive constraints on people that maybe this new way of working is making us rethink that?
got it. Okay, so we've got some. And I'm playing over here in the Miro workspace a little bit. We've got
Yeah.
some words here. We've got hybrid remote. We've got remote first. Um, you know, the way that you're framing it is different though, and it's not what people tend to search for. It's about the constraints, um,
Mhm.
or removing constraints. Hybrid remote. You use the word location free, I think,
Yes, that's
instead.
that's a term I'm starting to experiment with more.
Okay, and let's play this out a little bit. So I'm just gonna oversimplify this and just play with some sticky notes on the right. So let's say, I don't know, labor. And like maybe this is like labor that's knowledge work, maybe it's labor that's you know, not knowledge work. Maybe it's like something else, but like let's say companies need labor. And like, why do companies need labor? Well, there's some sort of work that they're trying to accomplish. And presumably, like my whole thing is that companies exist to like produce certain features, and the features they envision kind of make them worth working for or not working for, I think. Or the degree to which they should exist are the are the futures that the degree to which the futures that they believe in are worth like believing in, I guess.
All right, so let me ask this: are you referring to futures for the employees, the customers, or the stakeholders in the company?
I think like in the most global sense of the word.
Okay.
So when I say futures, I mean for the world, right? So like
Okay.
if we're doing this for the world, like BP has opinions about what the future should look like, right? And at the same time, you know, there are other companies, nonprofits, things like that. Like there's a local nonprofit in Pittsburgh called 412 Food Rescue, and they believe in futures where, you know, food waste is reduced and distributed to people who have food needs. Like
Yeah.
that's
Yep.
they're looking at honestly like a more efficient supply chain for food that also happens to meet human needs, and like meeting the human needs is the part that's motivating. And so those futures that they believe in, right? We, you know, I have like beliefs in futures around helping people build purposeful organizations that care about producing futures. Like, so that's the kind of like thing I'm thinking about. But like take your average enterprise, right? The sometimes it's not clear. Like sometimes it's like a very broad thing, like we're a healthcare company or we're, you know, hospitality or whatever it ends up being, right? So in general, I'm pulling this concept from Ikujiro Nanaka, and there's a book called Managing Flow, and there are other people who co-wrote the book too. They talk about like the purpose of knowledge-based firms in particular, and it's very much aligned with like, why do we exist? Well, because we have an opinion about what is aesthetically true, what is aesthetically beautiful, like what futures do we want to see produced. So the extent to which the companies are doing this on purpose, I don't know. That's a different question, maybe, because maybe like the futures that they're trying to produce is just futures where they make more money or something like that.
Right. So beyond the capitalistic approach, and so if you tap into other realms, I happen to be getting more familiar with what's referred to as donut economics. I don't know if you're familiar with that one.
It's new to me.
So it's how do you balance the ecosystem needs of the planet versus the social needs. So how do you deal with low income problems in a way that doesn't impact the environment? So you're constantly doing this balance, and there's one pulls you one direction, one the other, and the sweet spot is this sort of ring, which looks like a donut, hence the term donut economics.
Okay. It's like donut economics envisions certain futures where there's like a balance between ecosystemic needs and social needs, is the way I think you said that.
Yes.
Yeah. So like take whatever company it is, like software development, healthcare, nonprofit, government, whatever it is. They're envisioning these like kinds of futures, and they're like, we want to deploy labor against those futures. So I'm using like the value chain here, right? As a construct. And for those of you who are watching and like a little bit new to Wardley mapping, the value chain is just a chain of needs. It's got parts, it's got relationships, and usually we put users at the top. And I'm messing with a little bit by putting, you know, futures at the top.
Yeah.
But basically, the way you read this is, in order to produce futures, you have companies doing things, and in order for companies to do things, they need labor. So maybe like I'll just rephrase this as like company deployment of labor, something like that. And so then the question starts to be like, okay, let's talk about remote work. There's this idea that there's a place, and so let's talk about the how we got to like the predicament that we're in, right? Where it's like location specific labor.
Mhm.
Um, what, where does location factor into this? Think pre-pandemic, maybe even pre-remote software development jobs being a thing, or pre like I forget, like indie kind of lifestyle things, like
Yeah.
w- when we're talking about bricklaying or um, you know,
Yeah.
hardware
Yeah.
kind of stuff. Like, why would location be part of this system?
Well, when information sharing was most efficiently done by being co-located, that that was the key. And I believe some of the first office environments, yes, the turn of the 20th century, but the collaborative office spaces really started coming about, I believe, in the late 60s, early 70s,
Hmm.
as there was more of a shift to knowledge work. And the main communication method was still drawn on a blackboard. There weren't whiteboards then. So we're going that far back. And the best way to debate ideas and decide on direction was to get in a room, a physical room together. So it was mostly that information sharing, and I would say context sharing as well as part of that.
Okay, and I want to talk about the difference between information and context, and
Mm.
then I want to integrate some of the things I'm seeing in chat. Like Benjamin Atkinson goes back to the Industrial Revolution, is talking about like the place being
Yes.
near the power transmission shaft, which
Yep.
evokes some images, and it's interesting. Um, and Barber also mentions like using the term location dependent work, which I think is a type of work that, like paradigmatically, that location dependent work is almost like the setting for this value chain that we're playing with. So
Mhm.
let's talk about.
Yeah, because I could see like as far as knowledge work, medicine can be very location dependent, especially if you're working with a patient.
Yep, yep. So I'm just making a note here. So we're talking about location dependent work. Um, so talk to me about the difference between information sharing and context sharing, real quick.
So we've been doing some context sharing here. So what is the scope of the problem? What are the needs that we're looking at? What is this value chain? And so we're mapping out what we're including and excluding from the conversation. So that's just a very simplified form of context. And then information sharing is, okay, what are the details that are important to share in this conversation? What are some of the key questions we're trying to decide? What are some of those constraints? Are those constraints valid or not? How do we know they're valid? So there's all kinds of information around that context.
Okay. So would you say that the context is kind of like background for
Yes,
information sharing?
yes.
Okay. So I'm just gonna say information sharing depends on context sharing, and the information is like, I don't know. It's you mentioned constraints. You mentioned like questions, maybe decisions.
Yeah, data. What data are we seeing?
Okay, and I'm definitely gonna get this wrong, so just like let me know if I miss anything. But
Yeah,
this is mostly like flavor to get us to a place where we're talking about remote, right? So,
yep, yep.
um, yeah, and Benjamin is talking about Taylorism, and how the location dependent kind of work required like supervision and things like that. And this is, forgive me, like the very short rant on Taylorism. Um, I highly recommend reading the Principles of Scientific Management, because when you place that in context, it's actually like it was a huge shift from
Yeah.
in context during the, thinking about this kind of labor where it's like bricklaying and picking up pig iron and stuff like that. Um, the deal, so to speak, that Taylor proposed was a shift from gang work, which was basically in that moment. I mean, you're thinking about extraction of labor, right? So you had gang work and you had sandbagging, and so you had
Yeah.
people in the gang, and basically the performance was rate limited by the least performing individual. So to put it that way, which, say what you will about the paradigm of labor extraction and things like that, but like that was the status quo. And then Taylor came along and said, in probably less tasteful ways, is this, how would you like to be a high paid man? And something like that. And basically the deal was you could switch from gang work to individualized performance management, because Taylor was asserting that there was one best way for example, lifting pig iron. And so they had a manager driven individualized performance management where, yes, people were following you around with stopwatches. They were both learning how to do the one best way, but also teaching you how to do the one best way. And every day you'd get payment based on the performance against the standard. And so you got a feedback loop that was like tight like that.
Yeah.
And then human resources took the individualized consequences of performance management and then allowed us, as we sort of emerged into the knowledge work era, to go back to gang work. And like also the paradigm is entirely wrong for knowledge work too. So it's like
Yeah.
people hate Taylorism, but I think in context it's weirder than black or white kind of good badness.
Yeah.
And
I think it goes back to I forget who said the quote, but all models are wrong. Some models are useful, and for some at that time in that context, it had a use.
it involved increased wages is like, I
Yeah.
think the thing that's missing from that. And not to say that that makes up for being stopwatched, but
Yeah.
when you compare it to gang work, you get paid more. So
Yeah.
I mean, that kind of like paradigm was like a big deal, but of course it required location. So like there are reasons that look it required location, right? So information sharing in this case might also be like, I don't know what the right word is, but training slash supervision. So if we run with the Taylorism kind of idea real quick, information sharing, yes, it was like this pile needs to be over there, so pick this pig iron up and put it over there.
Yeah.
Like that's information.
Well, and also to kind of riff off of that, because people were in the same location, it was easier to gather those metrics
It's true.
because you
Yeah.
could observe, you could time.
So there's like an element of like supervision, supervisor decision making, or something along those lines.
Yeah.
And you can see how this immediately bakes into a hierarchy into management of labor and things like
Yeah.
that.
Are we working within standard or out of standard? Yeah.
Yeah. So you got standards, and so I'm gonna separate training from supervision. Yeah. So we got standards, we got training depending on standards, and then information sharing is like performance management, being aware of the performance of individual workers, because in Taylorism that was a thing. Like you literally, they counted out how many things of pig iron you moved.
Yep.
Every day, and you got you knew, in a weird way, like oddly enough, like you at least knew how you were doing, which is in contrast to the performance management systems of human resources today.
Well, and that even progresses today into things like manufacturing, but it's more measuring the processes. How many parts per hour are we assembling
Yeah.
or destroying, whichever.
Yeah, and there's like a way that the process itself entrenches. Like one of the things that came out of like Goldrat's material for me was, and I think there's like a lecture series called Beyond the Goal, that you can get on Amazon, and like one of the things that the lecture series pointed out was like the way that technology is tied to policy, and I think
Mm,
similarly, process, um,
yeah,
like
yeah.
in a sense, process is entirely fictional, right? I mean, it's
Hmm.
in a weird way like you'd view it as policy, and I think what you end up with is calcification of process when like you have an existing paradigm of like, hey, we have a thing that's working, we're managing individual performance, and we're on site and we're together, and I'm actually telling you how well you did every day, and you're getting paid based on that.
Hmm.
And also like that entrenches the need for supervision, because how else are we going to know how much to pay you
Yeah.
unless we can supervise and manage and so on. And like that's a paradigm, right?
Hmm.
So let's play with this a little bit. So there's some things here that we're probably missing to would probably need in order to have a more complete exploration of this. But
Yeah.
let's like knowledge work this up. So
Okay.
if this is like Taylorism, I'm just gonna copy this over to the right, and then I'm gonna just turn this into, let's talk about location dependent knowledge work, which I think is the paradigm that most people are familiar with at this point. At least for the folks watching this stream,
Yeah.
probably. Um, so what stayed the same? Well, we have companies still wanting to deploy labor towards producing futures, and they need labor in order to do that.
Hmm.
Um, there's still information sharing. There's still training. There's still standards? Question mark? Question mark?
Mm, yeah, it might depend on the knowledge work. So
That's a good point. So this is where Wardley's like evolution thing might be useful. Like
yeah, yeah,
we've got stage one stuff, we've got stage two, three, and four. And
yeah,
four is commodity, right? It's like completely certain. One is Genesis, completely uncertain. And so if your work is doing the same spreadsheet over and over and over and over again, like I
yeah.
think ERP might be an example, like an interesting example of this kind of stuff. Like if you're running a manufacturing plant, there was
Hmm.
knowledge work associated with calculating inventory and making decisions around like how to change the process in order to optimize it, and like you had to do monthly calculations of how
Yeah,
much of each type of raw material to buy, what other externally produced units you would have to buy in order to bring in so that you could assemble it together.
yeah.
And like
In that case, there's also still in the case of ERPs, there's still some customization. I know this from some particular client work when you're working with different vendors, changing vendors, or vendors are changing their processes and asking for different information.
hmm,
So
yeah,
we don't have to track that, but I'm just saying there's that standards kind of stretches across
yeah, i
there.
think i think that's right. And so this could get messy,
Yeah.
and it
And there's one big thing that we're missing now that we've started kind of spreading out the map here
mm-hmm,
across evolution is how we communicate,
yeah,
which has vastly changed in the last 20, 25 years. I mean, we wouldn't have a conversation like this with the technology of 20 years ago. It'd be a phone conversation,
yeah,
and we'd
yeah,
probably both want to get off the phone as soon as possible.
right, so we could get back to work. Yeah, and somehow we've ended up in like meeting cultures of like just yammering at each other for lengths of
Yeah,
time.
yeah,
Yeah,
because we can. So
because we can. Okay.
that's where that how we communicate and the technology around it is pushing us to even some more novel approaches.
Okay, so should we call that out as technology in particular? Like when you think of information sharing and context sharing, what of that is communication and what of that is separate from communication?
Yeah, So some of it is technology enabled,
Mm-hmm.
but some of it is uh, part process, part preference of different knowledge workers. So
Okay, say more.
to be a little more clear on that, um, when we now talk about synchronous versus asynchronous communication in remote teams, uh, it's a it takes a bit of a mental shift to leverage more the asynchronous ways of working. You'll still have meetings, but you'll have far fewer until you really need to hash out something.
Hmm.
So your your meetings become like a rare resource, and so you only use them for absolute necessity.
Okay.
Yeah,
This
protocols is a good way to capture it.
this is really interesting, and I think it ties back to so there's something going on here which I want to. So Benjamin Atkinson points out, aren't standards a form of structured data? And so I'm gonna poke standards for a moment, and then I'm gonna kind of come flying back here. So standards. What's interesting is what's hiding behind this word, I think, because on the one hand, like there's definitely like a version of the word standards, which is like, hey, what's the ISO standard for time? I forget the number code or whatever.
Yeah,
And that's like a document, right?
yeah,
It's
yeah,
structured
yeah.
data, to Benjamin's point. But then there's like standard ways of working.
Mhm.
And so like we have to be really careful about disambiguating what we mean by these things.
Yeah.
Because the practices are different from the data, are different from the activities. And so
Mhm.
that's a really important distinction around this. And I think it comes back and it applies here as well. Protocols. So I'm using the word protocol, but like I could say practices as well. I'm just gonna sync protocol, async protocol, practices, and these are ways of communicating. And I just want to like suggest something here. So I'm making information sharing and context sharing kind of part of communication. I'm just like saying this is all like part of it. Is that a fair move? Do you think?
Yeah, I think it. Yeah, I think it works for
Okay,
now.
so like let's just say all this is grouped together, and so I'm just gonna do that. And so I would guess that because we humans do a lot of communication unconsciously,
Hmm.
and the reason that I think that is because of how hard it is for people to listen and actually hear what other people are saying.
Yeah.
And I also think that we're just used to chattering too, and just like going through our little patterns and doing repeating the behavior that we've done days and days and days and days before. So I think, and I'm curious what you think, Mark. I think communication, generally speaking, has been a stage one ish, two ish activity. Now, I think there's a really decent argument around like the activity, like whether we do it as being standard, because obviously we're doing it
Yeah.
right now. But like
Yeah.
what it's like, I'll entertain arguments for other placement. But yeah, what do you think?
So I so as you said that, I was envisioning the the technology adoption curve of early adopters, late adopters, laggards, and I think there's maybe a bit of a parallel there. There's some of us that are quite comfortable trying to adjust some of our communication patterns, and we'll, yes, that one there, and so those of us that are in the innovators early adopters program will not only play with new technologies, but we'll play with new ways of communicating. So you and I have talked about things like clean language,
Mm-hmm.
which is totally a protocol. There's no technology there. It's just a way of asking questions
Yeah.
and to truly focus on listening. But not everybody does that. The same thing if you become a facilitator, you pick up a whole other set of skills to intentionally listen and help hold a bit of a structure. Sometimes it's referred to as holding the space for a group of people to accomplish a goal.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea is it's not your goal. Your goal is to hold the space so they can accomplish the goal.
Yep.
So I think there's a percentage that it is always new and novel to adopt or to update and modify communications. And then there's some that fall into that pattern that you're describing where we're just used to reacting in certain ways, probably because we've had past success in doing that.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. So there's like I think a behavior that humans have where as long as something doesn't hurt,
Yeah.
they're perfectly happy accepting a default. And I think in Simon Wardley's like view, like a lot of times defaults, or even just the way things were, represent inertia. And I like to use the word overcommitment whenever I think about inertia,
Mhm.
because it like you decisions were made, it is a commitment, and now the question is, are we reinforcing that commitment and overcommitting
Yeah.
and doubling down on paradigms that no longer serve us?
Mhm.
And that takes an active process of inquiry, like regardless of whether you're talking about like your own introspection or if you're talking about organizational like methodology and things like that. So
Yeah.
yep, defaults, inertia. Okay, I guess that's probably more like the late majority ish. There's
Yeah.
definitely
Yeah.
transitions here for sure,
Yeah.
and then they're actively like just resisting it, like doubling down, which I mean happens.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I mean, what happened during the pandemic is that whole curve just got smashed.
So say more about that. So this whole curve.
So the so at the stage we were at pre-pandemic, there were already many companies that were uh, fully remote,
Mm-hmm.
and there was I would say a good number, early majority, that were considering it. As the pandemic happened and people got forced out of their offices, more the early majority accelerated their plans, and the late majority and the laggards just got shoved into a very uncomfortable position that they couldn't double down. There was just no way for them to hold their position. They just basically had to wait it out. And so that's what made remote miserable for some. Yeah, Al, definitely for those folks. And those could be individuals, those could be organizations. That is a perfect picture. Yeah.
Let me just get the labels right here. So you got your laggards, and you got like basically
I was actually thinking, the Monty Python scene Bring Out Your Dead, but we won't go there.
yeah, but
I'm
like
not dead yet.
I'm not dead yet. Yeah, I love that. I gotta go rewatch those now that I think about it. So thinking about the football, right? It's like the football is our physical co-location,
Yeah.
and like I'm just gonna yank that out.
Yeah. And I'm sure that football got yanked from people several times a day over the last year and a half.
Yep. So now we're back in a weird spot, right? Um, well, we'll get to that in a second. So we're transitioning into a. We now have the option. Lucy is putting the football down again.
Yeah.
She's like, "Wanna kick it?"
Yeah.
And we're like, "I wanna kick it, but Delta variants though. Like I
Yeah.
don't, or whatever variant is like up next, right?" So I'm not sure if going back to the old paradigm is right, but we'll get to that in a second. So like finishing out the communication thought, like I don't know. certainly there are elements of communication that live over here in commodity. I think because it's unconscious, most of it, I think that makes it really, really hard to study. Um, and so maybe like the way I'll weasel my way out of this is like communication as in like how it works, like knowledge of how communication works.
Mm-hmm.
Here I'm weaseling. So this body of knowledge of how communication works. Like, well, you just talk to people. No, you never notice how like you disagree about things and then things get heated all of a sudden.
Yeah.
Like, that's just
Yeah.
you don't just talk to people. Like there's magic. Like we might as well be like talking about alchemy, the way that
Yeah.
people talk about communication.
Yeah. It's noticing it's noticing the patterns in your communication. And there are some common patterns, but until you start looking for it, you don't notice it. It's like the arrow in the FedEx logo. You don't until you know it's there, you never see
Yep.
it.
Yep. Well, and once you can see it, it's hard to unsee,
Yeah.
which is like one of the things that gives me hope in general is that like, hey, like actually for example, when it comes to remote facilitation, so I know you've done some work with Reese McCann,
Mm-hmm.
and Judy Reese, like she showed me how to do remote facilitation,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and she pointed at all the little moments along the way, all the little tricks about how to make it actually like an energizing experience.
Yeah.
And yeah, like I took some things and I didn't take other things, but like overall I could no longer unsee those aspects of remote facilitation. And so like every time I join an experience now that I'm not facilitating, it's like they're little friction points and I notice them and they hurt. I'm like
Yep.
ow,
Like
ow,
right now,
ow.
we're both looking at the camera because we know that's important to have that eye contact, even though we don't really see anybody. We're looking at plastic and glass.
Yeah, yeah, and it's all sorts of little stuff like that. Like even just
Yeah.
enabling gallery mode on Zoom,
Yeah.
huge. Like stop sharing slides, open up gallery mode.
Yep.
Like
Yep.
you'll do wonders for your remote meetings. And but I learned that from Judy, and so that kind of stuff, like being exposed to those kinds of experiences, gives me hope, right? Because have you ever experienced like really being listened to?
Mm-hmm.
Like
Yeah.
that's something you can't unexperience.
And this kind of gets to the root of why I reached out to you about this one. And it actually ties back into this whole communication topic. Um, One of the key things as you start to look for those patterns is there is a gap between what you receive and how you respond. That's one of the first things
Mm.
you start learning, and that you realize you end up telling yourself a story in that gap. You start interpreting the data that your senses collect, and you start sense making out of that. But is that story relevant? Is that story correct? Or is it just, as you were saying before, is it a habit? It's just the way we react to certain data our senses collect. The same thing for this push to go back in the office. Is this the right thing to do? Or is this a story we're telling ourselves around this? Yep.
Yeah, so this is something called the Ladder of Inference.
Yep.
And I'm gonna butcher the citations on this. This particular image came from the Fifth Discipline Handbook, I think. And the person who actually created the words, the concept of the Ladder of Inference is, I believe, Chris Argyris.
It
Um,
sounds right. Yeah.
so I might have some of this wrong. Someone can correct me in the comments or whatever. But um, yeah, this idea that like just because someone is communicating at you,
Mm-hmm.
like you're gonna select data from that, you're gonna add meanings, you're gonna make assumptions based on that, and then draw conclusions, adopt general beliefs about the world, and all that's happened inside your head, and the other person didn't participate in that very much, other than
Yep.
providing the initial thing, and so you can be like spinning and cycling on all sorts of BS without
Yeah.
realizing it, or
Yeah.
without the other person realizing it, which
Yeah. And then Virginia Satir took that and looked at how do two people basically climb up and down that ladder of
Hmm.
inference in a conversation. So she dealt with family systems, but it maps out to groups and teams and how are the teams reacting.
Which it's interesting, right? Because there's all this like knowledge out
Mm-hmm.
there
Yeah.
that's not deployed, right? So
Mm-hmm.
there's like plenty of stuff way out here that, well, I should say like in research circles it's well known, but it's not, and in psychology circles it's well known, but it's not deployed in work contexts,
Mm-hmm.
which cross contextual knowledge is always like really interesting. So then zeroing in on communication some more, like we have these tacit synchronous protocols
Yeah.
that it's almost like communication is hard, but the protocols of communication in person, well, like some people have trouble. Like I have trouble with this. Like I'm not particularly graceful in an in-person conversation. So like it's hard. But I've actually
So
like done a better job in remote than in
so
person.
let me ask this. So what kind of in-person conversations?
Yeah, that's a good question. Let's I'll actually distinguish and I'll throw away what I just said. So I'll throw away the like networking conversations. Very bad. I couldn't be impressive to save myself.
Yep.
Um, but if we're working on stuff together, that's easy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I learned long ago that if it's an interesting topic, I can definitely stay engaged in those synchronous conversations. If you want to talk about sports and stuff like that, I have a very narrow set of topics there that I will converse on. If you talk
Yes.
about if you talk about my favorite college sports team, I'm there. But otherwise, I don't care about the NFL or any. Yeah. So anyway, um, I'm with you on the limits of the synchronous conversation.
Yeah.
Um, so so this gets into another interesting aspect that comes up often in the I'll say the popular literature of remote because it's not always scientific. Matter of fact, it's rarely scientific. But choice being a key factor in
Okay.
remote.
Hmm.
So the choice of when to work, where to work, and that kind of challenges some of these protocols that we've put out there.
Okay. So choice about when, choice about where,
Yep.
and that's a constraint on labor.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So async protocols also enable these things, right? So async enables
Yes.
choice about when, async enables choice about where, and just kind of like zeroing in on this real quick, it seems like the dichotomy of all remote, all in person, all co-located, it seems to create this like exclusive or situation where either you're dealing with in person and so therefore communication technology isn't necessary,
Mm-hmm.
or you're doing it all remote, which means the only way you can communicate is by communication technology. And of course, it's not actually like that simple. Like there's lots of hybrid
I
messiness.
was I was going to say that. So if you're talking about knowledge work, it's hard to get away from technology.
Definitely. Yep.
So a research body of work I can point to is Karen Lejeski, Dr. Karen Lejeski, and Dr. Richard Riley have they've got three books on a concept called virtual distance. I think the best one is the latest one called The Power of Virtual Distance. And they're basically looking at communication mediated through a device. So basically it could be a phone, could be a laptop, could be whatever. And their prime principle is we are all virtual workers because we are all using, yep, that one there. We are all using devices in our knowledge work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which gets into some tricky like extended cognition stuff, and our tools are part of our thinking, and
Yeah.
If you want to get really weird with it, get some McLuhan in there. It's like the
Yeah.
tools are what you can think.
Yeah. Yeah.
um, ah, uh, which whole rant for another day. But the second brain stuff, where people are like
Yeah.
storing
Yeah.
resources and things in digital storage and then using them to stimulate thought, like whoa, extended
Yeah.
cognition, woo, exciting.
Yeah.
Um, and so then we've got basically ubiquitous deployment of synchronous protocols because it's socialized. Like we're born, we grow up around other people. They teach us how to communicate in person.
Hmm.
Probably occurring a little bit different for like Gen Zers and whatever's next, right? Because
Yeah.
those folks are like 5 years old. They're on TikTok or whatever. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
But like,
Well, yeah.
and there, what's interesting is like there's a rift, right? Because like TikTok discourse is a whole thing that a lot of us don't quite like understand, and I
Hmm.
count myself among that.
Yeah.
But the way TikTok is async communication,
Yes, it is.
and it's interesting how like because we weren't born in a situation where we had to learn how to do asynchronous communication on the daily
Hmm.
for work, for life, etc. We don't have these asynchronous protocols and practices like figured out for
No,
us.
no. They are a foreign language to many. But for those younger generations where they have grown up with all kinds of devices, I have three in my household at different times. Two are in college, but they still come back, and it just blows me away the number of different apps they use to communicate, and different, both synchronously and asynchronously. It's like this is coming, whether you want it or not, because
Yeah.
this is what the next generation is going to be comfortable with.
Yes. And from the standpoint of that you know Lucy and the ball, right? Like
Yeah.
there's kind of that obvious paradigm shift that's going to happen as those folks like I'm thinking about the kids. One of my good friends is a school teacher, and one of the hardest things for her over the course of the pandemic was having to basically start over from scratch,
Yeah.
everything from the curriculum to the way that they ran classes, like
Yeah.
because it all went remote.
Yeah.
And those kids basically had at least a year of basically learning practices and protocols about how to do stuff remote. And like there you can find like funny videos of like touching moments on like of school children. Like I think there's one where like a kid passes gas and like the whole room like loses it, but it's remote and they're all on Zoom and the teacher can't hold back her laughter. And like lots of
Yep.
like anthropological like interesting things happening there. But like those kids have had experiences now that we didn't have growing up, and so they're going to grow up and they're going to assume that things are possible that we assume aren't possible because they grew
Yeah.
up in school on Zoom.
Yeah.
And like the football is, we know at some point Lucy's going to pull the football out from under us. It's like, do we rip that band-aid now when maybe we might be too early, or do we do it later? I don't
Yeah.
know.
But it's not only the younger generations. The pandemic has, and I hate to call it a remote experiment, because that implies you either had choice or you're a lab rat. So I don't think anybody chose to.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm experimenting on my experience,
That's fine.
that's
Yeah.
fine.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
like, if someone's experimenting on me, gonna
There will be
contact the
there will
UN
be a
immediately.
planet of angry people. So,
Yeah.
uh, but but having been through the experience, and some being able to adapt and realize, oh, I can spend more time with family or
Yes.
friends, and if
Yes.
I have some flexibility in my schedule, oh wow, this allows me to actually get some exercise that I've been putting off forever. And so they're starting to see new possibilities if they have more control over their schedule, that's not constrained by a location and some of the constraints built into that location based work. Yeah, less fatigue. Yeah, no commutes.
Yep.
I found that I almost never listen to audiobooks anymore.
Hmm. Yeah. There are negative qualities too. Like one of the things that I did a value chain exercise with a client recently where we dove into the mechanics of like no longer going into the office, and it was things
Hmm.
like no transition. There's no
Yeah.
boundaries anymore between work and home. Work is home. Home is
Yeah.
work. And that is causing people to do all sorts of like interesting adaptations. Like one of my favorite stories is that someone started um, putting on shoes and
Hmm.
walking around the block every morning.
Yep.
Um,
Or some people have gotten in their car, drove around a little bit, and then
yep.
come back. It's like, all right, as long as you skip the traffic. Okay.
Yeah, and like now there's no passive media consumption. At,
Hmm.
at least not as much. Like yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. Like I used to listen to audiobooks and podcasts when I commuted
Yeah.
and things like that. And ever since going independent, like I haven't done that as much, nearly as much, unless I'm walking. And it's
Yeah.
like you have to basically, in the weird way, like the value chain got destabilized because Lucy pulled the football out from under it. Like the value chain, the whole thing is propped up on this concept of location, right?
Well, did it so so let me ask, did it get destabilized or did the just the needs change?
Um,
Or is it
yes.
somewhere in between?
That's so there's some interesting work that I played with by when I was doing some work with Jabe by Frank Geels, Geels, and it
Hmm.
talks about market stabilities and disruption and things like that. And there's
Yeah.
this whole like language and typology around how change comes to be. And so one of the things that they describe is like you can have a systemic shock. Um, I bet actually like I wonder if I can find an image of that real quick. So like something in the landscape, in the market landscape, like a policy shift. Um, yeah, here's an image. I'm gonna copy and paste this in. So this is like really fun stuff if you get into it. So it's called multi-level perspective. Jade Bloom taught me about this, which is really cool. So basically, like you have this idea of a stability, a stable regime. And it's a socio-technical regime, and it's all the things that like societies, technologies, all kind of configured together in a certain way. So it's like commuting and automobiles and audiobooks and like coffee morning routines and like all that stuff that was stable
Yeah.
pre-pandemic, and then what happened was like a landscape development occurred and a specific shock came along. So blah 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 blah. Pandemic, boom. Okay, now what it's done is it's shattered this stability by ripping. It's like losing the football again, ripping
Hmm.
out one of the lower like assumptions. So in the value chain, right, like location is at the bottom, and now we're saying nobody can be co-located. Stop it. Go.
Hmm.
Don't do that. This is no longer allowed.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's because of safety, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then because of the way value chains work, right, like all these relationships no longer function, which means synchronous protocols fall apart, communication, information sharing falls apart. People, this is the funny hierarchical part of this, like you can't be supervised as easily unless your employer installs spyware. So like all that stuff, good and bad, is completely disintegrated. And
Yeah.
so then what happens, right? So a couple things gets interesting, right? Because now when there's a destabilization, um, I'm just gonna like write this down, multi-level perspective, so that you all can Google that if you want. So because there's now a destabilization in that socio-technical regime, weird stuff can come out and sneak in,
Hmm.
basically, and replace old methods. And so like one very optimistic view of what might happen is like, hey, async practices could sneak in here. And I mean, it is basically sneaking in here and pushing out certain synchronous practices because
Yeah.
people just won't like people like being able to spend time with family
Hmm.
and redeploy that time with their commute and the fatigue that they were, having to drive for hours on end. People like living better lives.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Which has led to other kind of ripples, like the reference to the Great Resignation.
yep,
The 4 million in April that in the U.S. that quit.
yep.
Some of that was attributed to people wanting remote work. That wasn't the only attribution, but
Yeah, and like the companies that double down on the previous socio-technical regime, I
yeah,
mean, this is inertia, right? All
yeah,
over again.
yep.
If you double down on that, that's going to hurt. It may not like wipe your company out or anything, but it's going to hurt a lot, and then you'll be forced to make the change later. Like, why? Yeah.
Well, depending on the percentage of those companies that double down on that
Yep.
old regime versus those that double down on, okay, we are going to go remote. We
Yep.
are going to hire from anywhere. That's going to be the more interesting ripple down the road.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that would be an interesting thing to like start paying attention to signals.
Mm-hmm.
And for organizations out there that are not currently experimenting with remote practices, like they're still just like acting as if the pandemic happened to them and that they're powerless to actually adapt to it,
Yep.
or they're unwilling to make the changes that they need to make in order to make it a sustainable situation. Like, what would you say to them to convince them that it's worth paying attention to this potential interaction here? A small
Well,
task, right?
yeah. Well, I could say, well, nobody had this opportunity with the dinosaurs to have that conversation, but uh,
Be
I,
nice, Mark.
I well,
I'm kidding.
are these companies going to go away? No. Are they going to shrink in their influence? I think so. We've seen what's happened with the stock markets and the stability of companies on those, like the Dow Jones and everything else.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is we're going to be seeing the impact of this for years as companies start thinking about what does what does that work and what does that labor really look like for us, and what is that future that we want to create.
Yep. Yeah. The tricky thing is like there will be a new stability,
Yeah.
and it's true. Some of that stability might be co-location,
Yep. Yep.
but it's going to be a different stability, and you might not be part of it if you're
Yeah.
assuming that nothing has changed.
Yeah. And you might have even less access to people and capabilities because
Yes.
of that.
Yes. Yeah.
It's
And
like if you thought you had problems hiring last 2 years
dude,
ago, good luck.
oh, yeah, that makes me groan because companies were complaining about labor before this,
Yeah.
and
That's a whole other conversation. There are some untapped labor pools that people constantly ignore, but that's
yes,
another
yes,
conversation,
and what, and not to
which
get
has been enabled by remote.
yes, and it's about doing the work, right? And
Yep.
companies aren't doing the work, and regardless of whether it's about talent development, going out to those untapped labor pools, which, like, not running around this, like underrepresented groups in tech, like
Hmm.
obvious big one. And when we think about like too, like this is the frustrating thing about this, and yeah, I'm getting sidetracked at this point, but like this interaction here where we just said like no more location, sorry everybody, stay at home. This only happened to people who had the privilege that they could obey,
Yeah. Yeah.
and everyone else was like, well, I still have to work my job. I still have to go
Yeah.
to work. And so from the concept or from the digital divide conversation that I think really needs to be happening more, we have an entire like forking of labor right now where us nice like knowledge workers get to hide in our offices
Yeah.
with our internet and
Yep.
our teleprompters and whatever like fancy equipment and stuff that we can afford because the jobs are high paying and
Yep.
all that fun stuff. And then everyone else is just like service worker question mark.
Yeah.
Like we are
Well,
not.
I live in Orlando, the land of service work. So yeah, quite familiar with that. But there's other aspects like and I know we're gonna wrap up soon, but um, now those who are classified as neurodiverse have or should at least have a whole new set of possibilities opening up to them
Mhm.
because I'm not a specialist in the neurodiverse. I just know several people in IT that they struggle in the office,
Yep.
but being out of the office, they are quite capable.
Yeah.
And so when I hear these, oh, we can't find enough people, it's like you're not looking in all the right places.
Right on. Yeah. There's a good talk by Sal Freudenberg, which
Yes.
I'll
Yep.
link in here, called "Fish Climbing Trees,"
Yes. Yes.
which, oh goodness, thanks Miro for auto playing. I highly recommend this if you want to understand that a little bit better. And
Yeah.
it is literally true that if we are putting time and effort into understanding how to do asynchronous communication, we are literally opening up knowledge work labor to folks who have been excluded from that for a long, long time.
Yeah.
And the benefits of that are like incalculable. Like,
Yeah.
just,
Yeah. And if people are curious about that, there's a couple of folks that I'm kind of loosely collaborating with, or just a group that I haven't worked with yet, but I've been watching them on Twitter. Chronically Capable on Twitter. They're doing some amazing stuff. So this is somebody started by somebody who had a severe illness and had to work from home.
hmm,
And then
mm-hmm.
she realized there were many like her, and so she started a business around this. How do you get jobs for these people?
And
Yeah, that's
that's
it.
even more important with like long COVID and folks who are like, it's going to be a more common thing, I think, that look,
Yeah,
yeah. Anyways,
yeah.
on that lovely and optimistic note, what I'll say is, Mark, this has been an absolute pleasure exploring this with you. I feel like I learned a lot, and
Well, I did too. I want to go dig in on the multi-level perspectives now. So
yeah, it's mind blowing, and they have a whole like vocabulary for different kinds of transitions and different ways that those stabilities transition. Like,
interesting.
it's another instance of like, oh, words for this phenomenon that I didn't have or understand before. Really helpful stuff. And yeah, so you've got your book, which I linked in the channel back at the beginning. I'll also throw that in the description as well. Are there any other resources that you want to bring people's attention to in the context of hybrid remote work, or is there anything that you're working on right now that you'd like folks to know about?
Yeah. So I've been giving a series of talks. I've got a talk coming up at the Agile 2021 conference. Uh, but look for coming up on my website, markkilby.com/hybrid dash remote. Uh, I'm gathering all this different information. You heard me mention some of it here. I mentioned a lot of it in the talk, but I've got a series on Medium as well through another group, Pragmatic Publishers. They wanted to publish some of this stuff. I got some others, so I'm going to gather all this at that website. So if you want some of the same research, it'll be there for you, and that's also the best place to contact me. So.
Awesome. So I threw that link into the chat, and I'll also include it in the description. Thank you, Mark, and thanks everyone for coming and chatting and keeping us company as we explore this interesting area of hybrid remote work. If you have things that you want to see mapped in the Wardley mapping sense of things, let me know. We need to produce as many examples of maps themselves and the process of making maps as we can, so that as many people can participate. Simon Wardley wants to democratize strategy, right? So
Yeah.
let's help folks basically see things in a way that they can envision themselves doing. So if you have ideas about how to make that happen, let me know. I also encourage you to do streams like this yourself. That would be cool. If you need any help with that, or have any questions or anything about Wardley mapping that I can assist with, reach out to me at HiredThought on Twitter or ben@hiredthought.com. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And with that, I want to say have a lovely day.
Thanks, Ben.